just received the message that we can get started. We'll call the case of United States versus Kara Bassett. My name is Judge Brandon Harper. Scoring judges, please look at the two buttons on the lower left of your screen and please turn off your audio and your video. These should remain off until the trial ends. You should also have your video set to hide all non-video participants. This means the only people on the screen right now should be the two advocates and me. Can the attorneys please make their appearances?
Yes, Your Honor. Good afternoon. My name is Harsha Sridhar. I'm here today on behalf of the United States Attorney's Office.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Your Honor. My name is Samuel Gross. I'm here today with my co-counsel, Miss Kinsey Clark, who will be my silent second chair doing the magic tech work for our side today. And together, the two of us are representing the defendant, Kara Bassett, in today's case.
Good afternoon, Mr. Gross and Ms. Clark. We'll now hear, well, before opening statements, are there any matters that either party would like to address with the court?
Yes, Your Honor.
Go ahead,
first,
the government may proceed.
Yes, Your Honor. First, we'd like to invoke Rules 603 and 615. So that calls for the constructive pre-swearing and sequestration of all witnesses in this trial.
Does the defense have any objection to that request?
No objection, Your Honor. We'd love it if the witnesses tell the truth.
Those motions are both granted. So would the court.
And Your Honor, before we begin, I also want to draw the court's attention to one of the pretrial orders.
Okay.
Order number 7 says that exhibits 4 through 33 have already been admitted. So we're going to refer to those and show them to the jury without any further foundation throughout trial.
That's fine.
With that, the government's ready to proceed to opening statements, Your Honor.
Thank you. Anything from the defense before we proceed with opening statements?
Yes, Your Honor. Just two quick housekeeping matters that have to do with our online format today. For one thing, we wanted to put the court on notice just that the defense's office is on a highway today. So if there are any loud noises or sirens or things that seem to be coming from this end, we just ask that the time be paused until it passes by so we can continue, if that's all right with the bench and you, Mr. Schroeder.
The government have any
That's fine with me.
I think we all agree that we want to be able to hear you, so that will be fine. Just let us know if that's taking place.
Yes, Your Honor. And the second thing that we have is because we're online today, it'll be a little bit more difficult maybe to point to things on documents that I'm holding in my hand. So when we publish documents to the jury using the screen share feature, is it all right if my co-counsel just uses her cursor to direct the members of the jury to where it is that we're reading from so everyone's on the same page?
Does the government have any objection to that?
No, Your Honor. Anything to make the evidence easier to understand for the jury.
That's fine, and both parties will be permitted to do that if you so choose.
Yes, Your Honor. With that, the defense has nothing further. We're ready to go to openings.
Very good. Thank you. Before the government proceeds with its opening statement, everyone should make sure that they are now on speaker view. That button is the upper right of your screen. Attorneys, please remember to mute your audio when the other attorney is speaking. The government may proceed when you are ready.
Yes, Your Honor. May it please the court, members of the jury, the defendant kept her promise. On June 15, 2017, the defendant, Kara Bassett, got on camera and she made a promise. I will take people to their grave if I have to. I will do anything for these animals. You're going to learn today that she was talking about the elephants at the Greater Tallahassee Elephant Park. Until August 19, 2017, two people ran that park. The defendant and her husband, the victim in this case, Don Clark. You're going to learn today that the defendant and her husband, well, they had a basic, critical disagreement. Mr. Clark was a businessman. His goal was to bring as many tourists to the park as he could. You're going to learn that he wasn't above animal cruelty, that he'd lock the elephants in cages all day. And members of the jury, even if you don't care very much about elephants, that might make you a little angry. So it's easy to understand how angry that made the defendant, because you're going to learn that her lifelong dream was to open an elephant sanctuary. That in her own words, nothing was more important to her than her elephants. You're going to learn that at every turn, she told Mr. Clark, what you're doing here is wrong. It's cruel. You're going to hear that Mr. Clark's response was the same every time. As long as it's my money, we're going to run it this way. For years, the defendant watched. While her husband hurt the animals she cared about, in her own words, more than anything else. For years, Mr. Clark told the defendant that as long as the money was his, nothing would change. So in June of 2017, she made that promise. I will take people to their grave to protect these animals. In August, she kept that promise. Because the evidence will show that on August 18, 2017, late at night, she executed her plan. She injected her husband with a lethal dose of a powerful drug. She dumped his body in a swamp. You're going to learn that that solved the defendant's problems. Mr. Clark's money belonged to her now. With Mr. Clark dead, the defendant had full control over the park. The defendant kept her promise. That's why the government is charging the defendant with murder. And that means that we're going to prove today that the defendant killed her husband with malice aforethought. It just means that she killed her husband on purpose. We have to prove that beyond a reasonable doubt. As Mr. Gross will no doubt tell you, that's a high burden. With a crime this serious, it should be. And we're going to meet it. We're going to meet that burden by introducing you to the FBI agent who led this case, Special Agent Steph Johnson. Agent Johnson is going to testify about a document that Mr. Clark and the defendant signed, one that would give the defendant control over the elephant sanctuary. You're going to learn that the only way for the defendant to keep her promise, the only way for her to gain control of that park and to protect those elephants, was to get rid of her husband, to make him disappear. And Agent Johnson is going to show you that the forensic evidence links the defendant directly to the place where she got rid of her husband's body. I will take people to their grave if I have to. Members of the jury, I want you to think about those words today. When Special Agent Johnson connects the evidence to the defendant, remember the defendant's promise. I will take people to their grave if I have to. When Mr. Gross gets up here in a minute and tries to explain away that evidence, remember that promise. I will take people to their grave if I have to. Because on August 19, 2017, the defendant kept that promise. That's why at the end of this trial, I'm going to ask you to find her not guilty of murder, rather guilty. Thank you.
Thank you, counsel. Mr. Gross,
Yes, Your Honor. Opening for the defense.
you may proceed.
May it please the court, Mr. Schroeder. Members of the jury, when the FBI tells you they've arrested someone, when they tell you they found the person who did it and they've brought charges, you want to be sure that they're right. You want to be sure that the person they've arrested is the only person who could have committed the crime. You want to be sure that they ruled out every other suspect. When Mr. Schroeder got up here just a moment ago, he certainly made it seem like that's what happened in today's case. He made it seem like there was only one suspect, Kara Bassett. And it might have seemed like that because there's someone Mr. Schroeder didn't mention. Someone who was an employee of the animal sanctuary he talked about, someone who knew the victim, Don Clark, someone who had every opportunity to commit this crime. And that person's name is Kelsey Stebbins. I want you to make a note of that name because you're going to hear it a lot in today's trial. Kelsey Stebbins. Folks, what really happened in today's case is this. The FBI got swept up in the story and ignored the real suspect. Members of the jury, in August of 2017, you're going to learn that the FBI responded to a missing persons report for Don Clark. And when they did, they found themselves in the middle of a pretty sensational world. You see, Miss Bassett, the defendant, and her husband, Don Clark, owned their own private zoo with elephants. They lived lives that were larger than life. And they were about to be the subjects of an upcoming reality television show, a show in which Miss Bassett was set to be the star. You're going to hear today that from the start, the FBI bought into that narrative. They got swept up in the story. And you're going to hear that they cast Miss Bassett as the main character in their investigation. They interviewed her time and time again. They searched her home and her zoo and her phone records. And they ignored all the evidence they found that she was devastated by her husband's loss. She wanted nothing more than to see him again. Then ultimately, they charged her with murder. But members of the jury, today you're going to learn that they got it wrong. You're going to hear testimony from a woman named Jo Kwong. Miss Kwong is the television producer behind that reality TV show that's being made about the defendant's park. And she's going to tell you about Kelsey Stebbins. She's going to tell you that Miss Stebbins works as an animal handler at Miss Bassett's park. And today, the FBI agent, Agent Johnson, is going to have to take the stand and admit that Miss Stebbins also had access to that deadly toxin that Mr. Sridhar told you about on direct examination, that told you about on opening statement. That means that she had the means to kill Miss Clark. And the FBI agent is going to admit that Miss Stebbins' fingerprints were found all over the inside of that van, the same van that Mr. Sridhar told you was used to dump a body in the swamp. But you're going to hear that the FBI ignored Miss Stebbins, that they got swept up in the story and ignored the real suspect. But members of the jury, that's not good enough. See, when the government makes a charge like this, Mr. Sridhar is right. They come into the courtroom with a burden of proof. They can't just prove to you that it could have been Cara Bassett. Members of the jury, they need to prove to you that it could only have been Cara Bassett. They need to prove to you that it could not have been Kelsey Stebbins. They have to prove that beyond a reasonable doubt. Members of the jury, as the defense, we don't have a burden in today's case. We don't have to call a single witness or ask a single question. But we will show you today what the FBI ignored when we show you Kelsey Stebbins. You're going to see that they got swept up in the story and ignored the real suspect. And that's why at the end of trial, I'm going to ask you to find Miss Bassett not guilty. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gross. Before the government calls its first witness, I'll ask everyone to please switch to gallery view. That button is in the upper right portion of your screen, and this will allow you to see the attorneys and the witnesses at the same time. So make sure you please switch to gallery view. Does the government have a witness that it would like to call?
Yes, Your Honor. This time the government calls Special Agent Steph Johnson.
Agent Johnson. You may proceed, sir.
Yes, Your Honor. Please introduce yourself to the members of the jury.
My name's Steph Johnson.
What do you do for a living, sir?
I'm a senior special agent with the FBI.
How long have you been involved with the agency?
Well, my first year as a trainee in Quantico was in 2002, so just over 18 years now.
And what sort of work do you specialize in at the FBI?
I'm assigned to our Violent Crime Squad, a CR6. Primarily, I work on crimes like murder, kidnapping, bank robbery, and human trafficking.
What was your role in this case, Agent Johnson?
I was the lead case agent investigating the disappearance of Don Clark, and I arrested Kara Bassett, his wife, eventually for his murder.
I want to start way back at the beginning of that investigation. How did the investigation begin, sir?
It began when we received a 911 call from Miss Bassett reporting her husband's disappearance.
When did she say her husband had been disappeared since?
She said that the last time she had seen him was between 8 and 9 p.m. on August 18th, 2017.
Well, did Miss Bassett call you on August 18th?
No, sir, not the 18th.
Did she call you on the 19th?
No, sir.
How about 2 days later? Did she call you on the 20th?
No, sir, not the 20th.
Sir, when did the defendant call you to report her husband was missing?
Miss Bassett called us on August 25th, 2017, about a week after she had reported the last time she saw her husband.
When Miss Bassett called you, what was your next step?
Well, my next step was to go to the park and speak with Miss Bassett.
What did Miss Bassett tell you when you first spoke to her?
Well, she told me the story of what had happened the week before, how the last time she had seen her husband was a little before 9 p.m., and how she had woken up the next day without him there.
Did she have any idea, any clues as to where he had gone?
Ms. Bassett did say that she had found his van at the local airport.
Did you get a chance to examine that van during your investigation?
I did, yes.
And what did you find in that van? Did you find anything that helped your investigation?
In that van, we found a few pieces of evidence that helped the investigation. First was GPS data showing that van's movements on August 18th. And second was some forensic evidence.
I want to take those one at a time, and I want to start with the GPS data. Would you recognize a summary of it in court today?
I would, yes.
Mr. Gondam, could you go ahead and put up Exhibit 31 for us? Your Honor, this has already been admitted. So Agent Johnson, at a high level, what does this GPS data tell us?
So this tells us that on the evening of August 18th at 11:17 p.m., that car drove 139 miles to a place called the Big Gum Swamp, and that it arrived at 1:26 in the morning.
Well, after that van arrived at the swamp at 1:26 in the morning, did it stay there?
It did. In segment 3 there, it was stationary at the swamp from 1:26 in the morning to 2:10 in the morning.
After sitting in that swamp for almost 45 minutes, where did that van go next?
Well, at 2:10, it drove 132 miles back towards an airport that was located approximately 5 miles from the defendant's home, arriving there at 4:29.
Well, sir, did you investigate that swamp as part of your investigation?
I did, yes.
And how did that connect to the other evidence?
Well, some of the forensic evidence we had found in the van was algae. And so we compared the sample of that algae to the samples from the swamp, and we found a match. We also found a match of that same kind of algae on the defendant's boots.
Thank you, Agent Johnson. Mr. Gondam, can you put up Exhibit 5? Is this that forensics report you reviewed, Agent Johnson?
It looks like it, yes.
And in that report, did the lab tell you how common or how rare that algae was?
It did, sir. It said that combination of algae was fairly unusual.
So you're telling us that the algae in the defendant's boots matched the algae in the van and the algae in the swamp. Did you or your colleagues ever ask the defendant if she had visited that swamp before for any reason?
We did, sir. The defendant claimed she had never been there before.
You also said earlier that you investigated the elephant park where the defendant lived. What did you find in that search?
Well, during our search of the elephant park, we located a locked shed that was full of syringes of elephant tranquilizer.
What kind of effects does that elephant tranquilizer have?
We learned that elephant tranquilizer is strong enough to sedate an elephant, but can actually be fatal to a human.
Objection, Your Honor. Lack of foundation. May I be heard?
Please.
Your Honor, we'd ask that before they go into the effects of the elephant tranquilizer, they just lay a little more foundation as to how the FBI agent came to learn that.
Government have a
Your Honor?
response.
Yes, Your Honor. This witness learned that information from the material science data sheet. The MSDS is already in evidence. That was part of the judge's pretrial order. As I said, we're going to be referring to the contents of those documents without further foundation. So all the foundation that's necessary has already been laid at this point.
Response?
Yes, please, Mr. Gross.
Your Honor, we just at this point haven't heard from where the agent learned this information. That's the foundation that's missing.
I think that's right. I'm going to ask the government. The pretrial order certainly admitted certain documents, but is it the case that on that basis, we should assume that this witness has knowledge of those documents and their contents?
Your Honor, I can lay that foundation that this witness has reviewed the document.
I think that would be helpful. The objection is sustained.
Yes, Your Honor. Now, Agent Johnson, have you ever looked up any information about that elephant tranquilizer you found?
I have. I reviewed a material science data sheet regarding the effects that elephant tranquilizer can have.
And did that sheet tell you how dangerous the tranquilizer is for humans?
It did, sir. It said that even 1 milligram of that tranquilizer can be fatal.
And how many milligrams were in each syringe?
10 milligrams, sir.
Sir, do you know if the defendant was aware of how deadly that drug was?
Yes, sir. The defendant told me that even a few drops she knew could be fatal.
I got to ask you, Agent Johnson, why were elephant tranquilizers so important to your investigation if you were at an elephant park?
Well, sir, we actually found a log of those elephant tranquilizers, which showed when the doses were being used. And that log showed that there were 24 doses remaining as of the last one being used.
What did you find when you actually investigated the syringes?
We only located 23 of the doses.
Do you know if the defendant had access to those syringes?
I do, sir. She did.
You mentioned earlier that you sat down and you spoke to the defendant. Did she ever tell you what it was like to run an animal sanctuary with her husband?
She did, sir. The defendant expressed some frustration that this had been an elephant park instead of a sanctuary. She expressed some sympathy for the animals, wanting to be kinder to them.
Did the defendant tell you how Mr. Clark responded to those preferences?
The defendant said that even though she had expressed those preferences to Mr. Clark before, nothing had changed.
So, Agent Johnson, based on what you reviewed and what the defendant told you, before Mr. Clark disappeared, who had control over how things ran at the sanctuary?
So far as I could see, that was Mr. Clark.
Do you know if there was a way for the defendant to get that control?
Objection, Your Honor. Calls for speculation.
Response?
Your Honor, if I may proffer.
Why don't you just respond?
Yes, Your Honor. The witness is about to tell us that he knows about this mechanism through a document that's already been admitted, a letter from the victim's lawyer describing a clause in the contract that the defendant and Mr. Clark had. It's well within the scope of his knowledge to read from that document a certain section to explain to us his understanding of that contract based on what Mr. Clark's lawyer told him in a document that we have in evidence.
That may be true, but I think we're back to the same place we were before, where you're asking the witness to testify about a document and it's not clear yet that he has knowledge of that document. Mr. Gross?
Your Honor, we agree with the bench that they need to lay the foundation. One, that this witness was familiar with that document. And two, that this document would be responsive to the question posed. Because, Your Honor, opposing counsel just mentioned the fact that this document was somehow a mechanism to gain control of the park, whether there was a mechanism to gain control of the park. It wasn't clear from that question whether that's referencing a document or not.
Does government have a final response?
Yes, Your Honor. My question was whether the witness was aware if there was a way for the defendant to get control of the sanctuary, and the answer was going to refer to a document directly. The witness was going to say that based on a document he received, a document that's in evidence, a document we're going to show to the jury, he was aware of a way the defendant could get control of that sanctuary. I'm in the process of laying the necessary foundation as to how this witness is knowledgeable about that mechanism.
Let's see where he goes, Mr. Gross. The objection is overruled for now, but certainly please renew if he doesn't lay the appropriate foundation.
Yes, Your Honor.
Agent Johnson, do you know if there was a way for the defendant to get control of that sanctuary?
Yes, sir. We actually found mention of a power of attorney document in a letter from Mr. Clark's attorney.
And Mr. Gondam, could you put Exhibit 4, that letter up there? And can you zoom into that power of attorney clause? What did you learn from this letter, Agent Johnson?
Well, as you can see, this letter says that if Mr. Clark were to be incapacitated or disappear, that Ms. Bassett would gain control over his properties and assets.
And did you learn from that letter who had suggested that clause?
Well, sir, it says there that this clause was included at Ms. Bassett's direction.
All right, Agent Johnson, I just have a couple of questions about a woman named Kelsey Stebbins.
Sure.
Did you find any reason to believe that Kelsey Stebbins ever had any animosity with the victim?
No, sir. We found no evidence of animosity.
Did you find any evidence that the victim and Kelsey Stebbins had any relationship except for that between an employer and an employee?
Sir, we found no kind of motive for Kelsey Stebbins.
Did you find any forensics other than those fingerprints that linked Kelsey Stebbins to the car?
No, sir. The fingerprints were the only forensic evidence we found related to Kelsey Stebbins.
Did you find any evidence that linked Kelsey Stebbins to the swamp?
No, sir. We didn't.
Was Kelsey Stebbins ever dishonest with the FBI about her whereabouts?
Not to my knowledge, sir.
To your benefit, how did Kelsey Stebbins profit off of this death?
Sir, I think there's an objection.
Your Honor, I'm objecting lack of foundation to the fact that there was any dishonesty on the part of Ms. Stebbins about where she was or wasn't. In order for that to be true, the government would need to explain that there was a statement made for it to have been dishonest or not. And we have a good faith basis to believe that they never asked that question.
Response?
Your Honor, I think we're going to hear today that Kelsey Stebbins at some point spoke to the FBI, that Kelsey Stebbins made statements for a documentary. I'm just asking this witness if, to his knowledge, Kelsey Stebbins was ever dishonest.
I think then you should lay that foundation before asking that specific question. So the objection is sustained.
Yes, Your Honor.
Move to strike.
Agent Johnson,
Granted.
Agent Johnson, why didn't you consider Kelsey Stebbins suspect?
Sir, we found no motive for any of the other park employees in this case.
Thank you, Agent Johnson. Nothing further, Your Honor.
Thank you. Is there a cross-examination?
There is, Your Honor. May I proceed when I'm ready?
You may.
Just a moment of the court's time to set up. May I proceed?
You may.
Good afternoon, Agent. Can you hear me all right?
I can, sir. Good afternoon.
Thank you. I want to start by being very clear about one thing. Sir, you made exactly one arrest in today's case, right?
Yes, that's correct.
You arrested Miss Bassett, didn't you?
That's right.
You did not arrest someone named Kelsey Stebbins, did you?
That's correct, sir. We only arrested Miss Bassett for the murder of Don Clark.
You only made one charge in today's case, right?
You're correct.
You charged Miss Bassett.
That's right.
You didn't charge Kelsey Stebbins, did you?
You're correct, sir. We believe Miss Bassett was the one who committed this murder.
Well, let's talk about that. I want to go through some evidence today that might have pointed to either of them. Let's start with Miss Bassett. told us on direct examination that Miss Bassett had access to a van, right?
Yes, that's correct.
And you know that Kelsey Stebbins also had access to that van, right?
That's right, sir. We found Miss Stebbins' fingerprints inside of that van.
You know that you also found in August of that year, you would say, Miss Bassett, you ran a complete investigation on her, right?
Yes, that's correct.
Throughout your investigation, you interviewed her dozens of times. Isn't that true?
That sounds right to me, yes.
Through each of those interviews, she was consistent in her story, right?
That's correct, sir.
And she cooperated fully.
That's right, she did.
But sir, it's true that in today's case, there's some evidence that you weren't able to find in your investigation, right?
Yes, that's correct. We weren't able to recover everything.
Well, you'd say you did a pretty thorough investigation, that's true?
I would, yes.
A pretty thorough search of the park.
That's right.
Pretty thorough search of Miss Bassett's property, right?
That's right. Miss Bassett lived on the park property.
Through that thorough search of Miss Bassett's property and Miss Bassett's park, you never found the victim's phone.
That's correct, sir. We never recovered Mr. Clark's phone.
You didn't find his wallet.
That's right.
Didn't find his keys.
You're correct, sir. We never recovered his keys.
At one point today, you were told Mr. Clark had a gun, right?
At one point during the investigation, we did find an account of that, yes.
You never found that gun, did you?
That's right. We never recovered a firearm.
Now, I should qualify that. I should say you didn't find that gun in the search of the park, right?
That's correct.
You also believe Mr. Clark was killed using a syringe of elephant tranquilizer, right?
Yes, that's right.
But Agent, you never found that syringe, did you?
That's right. That was that 24th syringe that was missing, and we didn't recover that. You're right.
Well, let's talk about why that might be. Just to make sure we get this straight, you believe that Don Clark was killed in the elephant park, right?
Yes, that's correct.
You know that Kelsey Stebbins is an employee of that park.
Yes.
You told us before that Mr. Clark was killed with an injection of elephant tranquilizer. On direct examination, you showed us a log, right? You talked about a log of that tranquilizer.
That's right. That was one of the pieces of evidence we recovered.
You know that that elephant tranquilizer, in order to access it, you needed to use a key. True?
That's true.
You needed to sign in on that log.
You didn't theoretically need to, but that was the typical practice.
Well, Ms. Clark, let's go ahead and take a look at who's on that log. Can you put up Exhibit 19 already in evidence? Thank you, Ms. Clark. Agent, this is that log of the tranquilizers, isn't it?
Yes, it looks like it.
You've reviewed this document, haven't you?
Yes, I have.
And there's a column on that document called Administrator, right?
Yes, sir.
It's got some initials in there, doesn't it?
Yes, it does.
We see the initials KS in that Administrator column several times, right?
That's correct, sir.
All right, you could take that down, please, Ms. Clark. Now, you told us on direct examination that Mr. Clark's hair was found in the back of a park van, right?
We did find that hair there, yes.
You believe that he was loaded into that van, true?
Yes, that's right.
And you showed us on direct examination that that van was driven to Big Gum Swamp and back, right?
Yes, from those GPS records.
Like we talked about on direct examination, Kelsey Stebbins had access to that van, didn't she?
She did, sir. We found her fingerprints in there.
And the logs that you reviewed of GPS data didn't show who was driving the car that day, did they?
That's correct. They didn't.
So let's talk about the mud that you mentioned. You told us that you found mud from Big Gum Park on Miss Bassett's boots, didn't you?
Yes, that's correct.
But you don't know who was wearing those boots when she got mud on them, do you?
No, sir. Just that the mud was on the boots.
Hey, Agent, I want to try something. I've got my own pair of hiking boots right here.
Okay.
If I were to go outside and take these boots and stamp them in mud, I get some mud on the boots, right?
Yes, you would.
And then if I was to come back inside, I might get mud inside.
Yes, that's true.
And then if someone else was to step on that mud inside, they might get mud on their shoe, right?
It's possible, yes.
Now, Agent Johnson, it's also true that if I stepped in some mud with my shoes and splashed around, I might get mud on my clothes. True?
It's possible, sir. It depends on how high the mud splashed.
When you searched Miss Bassett's house, surely you looked at her clothes, didn't you?
We did.
You didn't find any mud on any of her other clothes that matched the ones from the swamp, did you?
That's correct, sir. The only mud that matched was the mud on the boots.
You also found that mud matching in a park van, right?
That's right. It's the van we've been talking about.
Like we talked about, that van went to the swamp, true?
Yes, sir.
And then that van came back to the airstrip.
That's right.
And you don't know if whoever was driving that van then tracked the mud back into the zoo, do you?
You're correct, sir. We didn't find any trail of that, but we don't know.
Thank you, Agent Johnson. We've got nothing further.
Thank you, Mr. Gross. Does the government have a redirect examination?
No, Your Honor.
Okay, thank you, sir. You're dismissed. Anything further from the government?
No, Your Honor, at this point, the government rests.
Very good. Does the defense have a witness?
Yes, Your Honor. This time the defense calls Joe Kwong.
Okay.
May I proceed with the court's permission?
You may proceed.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Can you please introduce yourself to the members of the jury?
Sure, my name is Joe Kwong.
Where are you calling in from, Miss Kwong?
I'm in LA right now.
How are things in LA?
Everything's still locked down, but we're hanging in.
I'm glad to hear that. Ms. Kwong, why don't you start by telling the members of the jury about what you do for a living?
Sure, so I'm a producer. I work on reality television, documentaries, that sort of thing.
And what's your involvement in today's case?
Well, Miss Bassett actually hired me to work on a documentary for her. It was about the elephant park, her life.
Did production of that show you were working on stop after Dawn Clark's disappearance?
No, it didn't. We kept filming. We, created episodes about the disappearance and the FBI investigation. I think those episodes are going to be really good. People are going to like them.
So we'll talk about the disappearance and the investigation in just a second. But I wanted to start, Ms. Kwong, by asking you about the relationship between Kara and Dawn Clark. Were they married when you started producing your show?
Yeah, they were. I started working on the show a few years back, 2015, and at that time when I met them, they were married.
What would you say their relationship was like?
They were really affectionate with each other. They were passionate people. They would fight sometimes, which makes for great drama, great TV, and they would usually make up afterwards.
You said you've been watching them closely while you were working on this reality show. Did either of them ever speak to you about marital problems like infidelity?
No, neither of them ever said anything like that.
Do you have any reason to believe that either of them was having an affair of any kind?
No, I never saw anything like that.
What about the lead up to the disappearance? Was there anything unusual you observed about their relationship at that point?
I don't think so. I don't remember anything unusual. Everything was pretty normal.
We've heard today that Miss Clark waited about a week, that Miss Clark waited about a week before she reported her husband missing. I want to talk about why that might be.
Okay.
Her husband, Mr. Clark, did he ever travel out of the country?
Yeah, he actually had his own private plane, which he took me up in one time so I could get aerial shots of the elephant park, that sort of thing. And I know he had a vacation home in Costa Rica, so he would fly that plane there sometimes.
Did you have any reason to believe that there was a trip to Costa Rica he might have been planning around the time of his disappearance?
Yeah, so I actually overheard a conversation between Kara and Don on the day that he went missing. I remember hearing something about Costa Rica, and then Kara said that she didn't mind if Don went.
I'm going to show you a record of calls and texts from Don's phone, and we're going to see what we can make of that together, okay, Ms. Kwong?
Okay.
Ms. Clark, can you go put up Exhibit 21? Thank you, I appreciate that. Now, let's take a look at the first page, the phone calls. Now, Ms. Kwong, you told us you overheard a phone call on the day of the 18th. Is that call listed on this call log?
Yes, it looks like that. A first call, the one between Don and Kara.
Thank you. Ms. Clark, let's scroll to the second page, the text messages. Let's take a look at text messages 3 and 4 if we can.
Okay.
Ms. Kwong, first of all, can you read for us when those two text messages were sent, please?
Sure. The first text was sent at 2:32 p.m. And then the second one looks like it was received at 2:33 p.m.
And would you do us the favor, please, of reading what was in those text messages and who sent them?
Of course. So it said, the first text message says, "Want to talk to you about trip to CR." That was Dawn. And then the next one says, "Okay, but I'm fine with whatever. Just want you to be happy. Love you." Heart emoji. And that was Kara.
Okay. Thank you, Ms. Clark. Let's take down that exhibit. All right, now let's go ahead and talk about the disappearance.
Okay.
How would you say that Kara Bassett responded to her husband's disappearance?
She was sad. I mean, really sad, depressed. I had never seen her so unhappy in the years that I had known her.
Let's go ahead and talk about the police's investigation. Were you able to observe their investigation as a reality documentary filmmaker?
Yeah, I did. Kara asked me to, keep filming, follow around the FBI, see what they were doing. So I did.
Ms. Clark, can you go ahead and pull up Exhibit 18, please? Ms. Kwong, have you ever seen anything like this in the park?
Yeah, I have. It looks like one of the tranquilizers they use for the elephants to sedate them.
Do you know where those tranquilizers are kept in the zoo?
Yeah, I do. They're stored in this shed on the property where they keep other medical equipment.
And are there any precautions around them?
Yeah, so the shed it has a lock on it, so you need a key to get in.
Now, Ms. Clark, let's go ahead and put the log back up, Exhibit 19. Ms. Kwong, I'm showing you a log of people who've accessed these syringes. Do you recognize the initials in the administrator column here today?
Yeah, they look like employees at the elephant park.
You see the places where it says the initials KS?
Objection, Your Honor. At this point, needlessly cumulative. May I be heard?
Yes, please.
Mr. Gross just went through this exact line of questioning with Agent Johnson. He put up this list, asked what the initials KS stood for, and asked Agent Johnson to note where they appeared. He's doing the exact same thing here. This witness is a documentarian. She can't add any additional knowledge here. And frankly, Mr. Gross isn't asking her to. He's just rehashing the same testimony here, and it's needlessly cumulative.
Response?
Yes.
Your Honor, what we're going to go into here that's the probative value of asking this witness is whether she's familiar with agents on the staff who have the initials KS. Now, because she has so much background with the zookeepers and animal handlers in this case, she'll be able to tell us whether there's one or more than one person whose initials match KS. And that's probative in today's case.
Does the government have any final response?
No, Your Honor. We stand by our objection.
Overruled.
Now, Ms. Kwong, the initials KS, can you think of anyone who's an employee at the park with those initials?
Sure, yeah. The only employee I know at the park with those initials is Kelsey Stephens.
Thank you. Ms. Clark, let's take that now. I want to talk about Kelsey Stephens. Who is she?
She's an employee at the park. She's an elephant handler.
You said you followed the FBI around. Did you ever see them interview Kelsey Stebbins?
No, I never saw that.
Did you ever see the FBI ask Kelsey Stebbins a single question through their entire investigation?
I never saw them ask her any questions.
Thank you. We have no further questions.
Thank you. Is there cross-examination?
Yes, Your Honor.
You may proceed.
Just a moment, Your Honor, while I adjust this. Good afternoon, Ms. Kwong.
Hi there.
In your own words, the defendant has been very generous to you, right?
That's right.
In 2015, it was the defendant who hired you to make a documentary about her life.
That's exactly right. She pitched me this great idea. I thought it was awesome. It was a really good project for me to be working on.
The defendant paid you $5,000 a month to film her.
That's right. Well, not just to film her, for all my work with the documentary, you know, hiring other people, production, the whole thing.
The $5,000 to produce that documentary every month.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
And the defendant also said she'd give you 20% of whatever that documentary eventually sold for.
That's true.
So I want to get these numbers right. You filmed from August 2015 all the way till the defendant was arrested in September 2018, right?
Yeah, that's right.
That's about 3 years.
About so, yeah.
It's about $175,000 the defendant paid you.
Don't know the math off the top of my head, but I'll take your word for it.
And now that documentary, ma'am, you're getting offers for it for $10 million.
That's right. Yeah, a really big streaming service has contacted us. We're hoping the deal goes through, but there's no telling.
So 20% of that is another $2 million because the defendant reached out to you and asked you to make that documentary.
Yes, sir. That's my stake in the documentary is that 20%.
And today you're testifying for the star of that documentary, the defendant, Kara Bassett.
Yes, sir.
Ms. Kwong, I want to talk about some footage that's going to appear on that documentary, some things the defendant said on camera. You'd recognize those videos if I showed them to you, right?
Sure, yeah, I'm sure I would.
Mr. Gondam, could you put up Exhibit 37? Does this look like one of those videos, ma'am?
Yeah, this looks like one of the interviews I did with Kara.
Looks like a fair and accurate representation.
I think so. This picture does, yeah.
Your Honor, at this time, government moves Exhibit 37 into evidence.
Any objection?
Yes, Your Honor. We'd object under Rule 106, the remainder of related writings, and the rule of completeness. And we have reason to believe that this exhibit is part of a series of interviews that this witness made with both Ms. Bassett and other members of the park, many of which are included as exhibits here. In order to understand the context of what's here, it's important that under Rule 106 that they all be admitted. Now, we understand for purposes of time that Mr. Sridhar doesn't have to play all of them, but for the jury to review the context of the documentary when they go back to deliberate is important. So we'd ask that they all be introduced at this time.
You're essentially asking, Mr. Gross, that the entire documentary be admitted? All of the documentary that deals with interviews with your client?
Your Honor, there are a number of clips in today's case that are included as exhibits that have been pre-marked, all of which are ones that the witness on the stand made. And we'd ask that they all be introduced at this time, even if Mr. Sridhar is only going to be talking about one of them, so that the jury in fairness can consider the context of the others when they're reviewing this one.
Any response?
Yes, Your Honor. I don't think the rule of completeness applies to these. These are standalone sentences. These are comments Ms. Bassett made to the camera, and the clips that we have available go over the course of multiple months, perhaps multiple years. We're just playing a couple of clips. If Mr. Gross wants to get up on redirect and introduce other pieces of evidence that are Ms. Bassett's comments, he's welcome to do that. But I don't think, as part of the rule of completeness, every single one of those clips needs to be entered into evidence. Each one of them can be understood standalone, Your Honor.
May be heard, Your Honor?
Yes.
Your Honor, one of the things that this witness testified she was trying to do was construct a plot line, a television show. Now, what they're doing here, the government, is they're taking one piece of that story out of context. And if they want to talk about this, surely the jury ought to be able to consider the other parts of that story that are being told, the other interviews that this witness made.
Yeah, I think we're not going, the court's not going to require that the government offer at this time every clip from the documentary that's available as an exhibit. But to the extent that there are other clips of the defendant making statements, because she's the defendant, I do think under Rule 106, it would be fair for the jury to be able to review her statement in context. And so I'm going to sustain the objection, but not require that the government play all of the other recordings at this time. To the extent, Mr. Gross, that you want to do a redirect examination, of course you can play other videos that are being admitted at this time if you think that would be helpful. So the objection is sustained.
Yes, Your Honor.
Your Honor, just to be clear, for the sake of time when we're entering this exhibits, obviously it would be arduous for us to play each one of them. Can I just ask the witness to confirm that she had a number of video clips that became exhibits in this case, given that she's viewed them and then we enter them all?
Yes, absolutely. And when I say sustained, I sustained in part and overruled in part. The exhibits are all admitted.
Yes, Your Honor. Now, I want to talk about a couple of these video clips, Ms. Kwong. Let's start with this one here. Play it, Mr. Gondam.
Nothing is more important to me than these animals. Nothing.
And can you play Exhibit 38, Mr. Gondam?
People look at me and they think I'm sweet and nice. Go on. Keep underestimating me. I will lobby senators. I will protest big businesses. I will get in your face. I will take people to their grave if I have to. I will do anything to protect these elephants.
Thank you, Mr. Gondam. Now, Ms. Kwong, you know those videos were taken on June 15th, 2017, right?
That's true. That's when we filmed these interviews.
So 2 months before Don Clark disappeared, his wife was on camera talking about taking people to their graves to protect the elephants.
That's what she said. She was our elephant queen. That was the whole point of the documentary.
Ms. Kwong, collecting that video, now worth millions of dollars to you, it came with a condition, right?
What do you mean, sir?
Well, the condition was that sometimes you weren't allowed to show people what was really happening between the defendant and her husband.
I don't know what you mean by that. There were times that Kara and Don didn't want me to film, private things.
Right? Sometimes the defendant would make you turn off your camera.
Sure.
Sometimes the defendant would make you delete video.
Yeah, that's right.
Ms. Kwong, now that we're in court, I need you to be honest about what exactly was happening when they made you turn that camera off. The defendant and her husband were getting into fights, weren't they?
That's true. I did witness a few fights between Kara and Don.
The defendant was angry that Mr. Clark wasn't turning the park into a sanctuary.
That's right. Yeah. Kara thought the park should be an elephant sanctuary and, run that way.
And Mr. Clark disagreed.
That's true.
The last time they fought, that made the defendant so angry that she threw a vase at Don Clark's head, right?
Yes, sir. That did happen.
On that time, when the defendant resorted to violence, that was either July or August of 2017, right?
That's right. I couldn't tell you the exact date, but it was sometime that summer.
Objection, Your Honor. Misstates the evidence. May I be heard?
Yes.
Your Honor, as to the question when the defendant resorted to violence, we didn't hear that she hurt Don Clark. That's a misstatement of the evidence, Your Honor.
Response?
Your Honor, if someone throws something at someone and they miss, that doesn't make what they're doing non-violent. It's violent, at least in intention, Your Honor.
Response, Mr. Gross?
Your Honor, the question was when she resorted to violence. We haven't heard any testimony that what she actually, in fact, intended at that moment was to hurt her husband. Perhaps it's the case that what she decided to do was break something in a dramatic fashion because she knew the cameras were rolling. Members of the jury, Your Honor, we haven't heard that she resorted to violence to try and hurt her husband, and to claim otherwise misstates the record.
What was the specific testimony that the witness gave about breaking the item?
Your Honor, the witness said that, the defendant was so angry that she threw a vase at Mr. Clark's head.
That strikes me as violent, even if she didn't succeed. So the objection is overruled. Mr. Gross, I think you wanted to say something back during the 106 argument. Did you want to add something?
Very quickly, I just wanted to clarify which exhibits are in right now. They're the statements made by Miss Bassett.
That's correct.
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay.
Thank you.
Objection overruled.
Yes, Your Honor. So to be clear, ma'am, when the defendant resorted to violence on camera, that was a month before Don Clark went missing.
Something like that. A month, 2 months. I can't tell you for sure. Sorry.
But it was in the month to 2 months before Don Clark went missing.
That's right.
Ms. Kwong, after Don Clark disappeared, you said the defendant seemed sad.
She was sad. I mean, I had never seen her like that before. It was hard to watch, honestly.
She seemed scared,
Yes, sir.
depressed,
Yeah,
confused.
that's right.
Well, that lasted about a week.
That's right. That's how long she was, really depressed, really having a hard time.
And in that week, you never saw the defendant pick up the phone and call the police.
I was actually out of town for part of that week, but you're right. I never saw that happen.
Ma'am, let's talk about what she did afterwards. With
Okay.
Don Clark gone, the defendant was the only person in charge of the elephant park, right?
Kara was, yeah.
Oh, that's right. The defendant took the elephants out of the cages.
Yes, yeah. Eventually, she ended up turning the zoo, the elephant park, into a sanctuary.
She didn't let the guests ride them anymore.
That's right.
Ms. Kwong, the defendant said on video that she would do anything to protect those animals, right?
Yeah, the video you just played. Yeah.
And she kept that promise, didn't she?
What do you mean?
Well, she turned that park into a sanctuary when her husband was gone.
That's right. She did end up turning it into a sanctuary.
Ma'am, I have a few questions about someone Mr. Gross asked you about named Kelsey Stebbins.
Okay.
You have 2,000 hours of footage at that park, right?
That's right. More than 2,000 hours. It's been tough to go through.
A footage of employees,
Yeah,
footage of Mr. Clark,
definitely.
footage of the defendant.
Yes, sir.
You haven't found any video in which Kelsey Stebbins and Mr. Clark ever had an argument.
No, I don't think I ever filmed an argument between the two of them.
You never found any evidence that Kelsey Stebbins held any grudge against Mr. Clark. Didn't hear her talking about that.
She never said anything like that to me.
Thank you. Nothing further, Your Honor.
Thank you. Mr. Gross, is there any redirect examination?
Yes, Your Honor, briefly.
May proceed.
Ms. Kwong, hello again.
Hi.
Opposing counsel a moment ago showed you a video that you took of Miss Bassett. That's right?
Yes, that's right.
Was that the only video you took of Miss Bassett?
Oh, no, definitely not. I have tons of videos from her from, throughout the years.
Do you think you'd recognize one more from about a week after Dawn disappeared?
Sure.
Ms. Clark, why don't you go ahead and put up 39? Can we play that for the members of the jury? It was just a moment.
My husband is gone. It's been more than a week. Hasn't called or texted or anything. I don't know where he's at. And I'm really worried about him.
Thank you, Ms. Clark. And Ms. Kwong, was that a video that you took?
Yeah, that's a video I filmed with Kara.
Now, the video that opposing counsel showed you where he said that she'd be willing to put people to their grave. In context, did you understand that as a threat against Don's life?
Objection, Your Honor. Relevance to whether this witness perceived that as a threat?
Response?
Your Honor, opposing counsel has made it their contention, their central contention in today's case from opening, that "I'll put you in the grave" was the promise that she made. And they've made it seem from opening statements like that was about Don Clark. We heard that video on examination, the direct examination of Mr. Sridhar, and what she in fact said was that she was willing to go to Congress, go to Senate, advocate in any number of ways, and then at the end of that list, she'd be willing to put people in her grave. So I'm asking the witness whether she understood that as a threat against Don Clark, like opposing counsel has construed it.
Sure, but I think the government's point is, what does it matter if this witness construed it as a threat or not?
Your Honor, we'd be happy to rephrase the question.
Okay, sustained.
Ms. Kwong, in that video clip, was the defendant talking about Don Clark?
Objection, Your Honor, to lack of personal knowledge.
Response?
Your Honor, if we may, the text of that video clip was about advocating in the Senate and Congress, and Don Clark's name didn't come up.
May I respond, Your Honor?
Yes.
The particular phrase we're focusing on here is, "I will put people in their grave." This witness has no way of knowing whether that excluded or included Don Clark, especially if I have a good faith basis of belief that this witness is going to say it didn't include Don Clark. We have no reason to think that she has a way of coming to that conclusion. There's no foundation been laid to that extent.
Response?
Very briefly.
Your Honor, we're just asking generally whether in that clip, what the topic of conversation was Don.
I think you can ask the witness whether he was mentioned by name, but be careful that you're not asking her to draw conclusions about what the defendant intended.
Yes, Your Honor.
That I think would be improper, and counsel would be right to object to that.
Yes,
Yes, Your Honor.
So the objection is sustained. You can rephrase and ask the witness precisely about what was said.
Yes, Your Honor. Ms. Kwong, in that clip, did the defendant ever mention her husband?
No, she never said his name.
Thank you. We have nothing further, Your Honor.
Thank you, counsel. Anything further from the government?
No, Your Honor. We're ready for closing statements.
Okay, the witness is excused. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Your Honor.
We'll now hear the closing arguments from each party. As we did with the opening statements, everyone should please switch back to speaker view. Also, since both witnesses have completed their testimony, scoring judges should now complete the witness portion of their ballot. Once everyone has switched back to speaker view, the government may begin its closing argument. You may proceed.
Yes, Your Honor. Members of the jury, the defendant kept her promise. This case really is that simple. As members of the jury, you heard that today, the defendant and her husband, they had a disagreement, a fundamental disagreement, an ultimately deadly disagreement. Mr. Clark wanted to run a business. He wanted to make money, even if that involved animal cruelty. The defendant wanted to protect those animals at all costs. On June 15, 2017, the defendant got on camera and she made a promise. Played for us, Mr. Gondam.
I will take people to their grave if I have to. I will do anything to protect these elephants.
Today, you saw that's exactly what the defendant did. Because the evidence shows that there was only one thing between the defendant and her lifelong dream. Her husband, Don Clark. In her own words, nothing was more important to her than her elephants. And for years, the defendant watched while her husband hurt them. So in June of 2017, the defendant made that promise, "I will take people to their graves." In August of 2017, she kept it. On August 18th, she executed that plan late at night. She injected her husband with a lethal dose of a powerful drug, and she dumped his body in a swamp. As he learned today, Mr. Clark's money became hers, and so was that elephant park. Within 2 months, the defendant changed that park into a sanctuary. She got what she wanted. The defendant kept that promise. And that's why the government has charged the defendant with murder. So we had the burden of proof today. We had to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant killed her husband, what we call malice aforethought. That's another way of saying she knew exactly what she was doing. We met that burden by showing you how the defendant kept her promise. Today you met the lead investigator in this case, Special Agent Steph Johnson. And he showed you exactly how the defendant kept her promise because he took you through what happened the night of August 18th. You learned that by working at an animal sanctuary, the defendant had access to a deadly weapon, elephant tranquilizers. And the defendant knew just how deadly those tranquilizers were. You heard that she knew all it took was a few drops to kill a person. And the syringes add 10 times that. So at 6 p.m., the day Mr. Clark disappeared, we know there were 24 of those syringes. Faculty was searched the next week, and there were only 23. There was one syringe accounted for, members of the jury. One syringe the defendant had access to, one syringe the defendant used to kill her husband. After killing her husband, the defendant had to get rid of the body, and you saw today that she did exactly that. At 11:17 p.m., Mr. Clark's van was driven from the defendant's park to the Big Gum Swamp, where it stayed for 44 minutes, before it returned to an airport in Tallahassee where the defendant lives. You saw a forensics report that ties the defendant directly to that van. The same rare combination of algae found in the defendant's boots were found in the van and the swamp. Members of the jury, it's not just the weapon and the forensics that point to the defendant. It's the motive. Because today you learned about that promise the defendant needed to keep, that she hated the way her husband ran the sanctuary. She hated that the animals were in cages. She hated that as long as it was his money, nothing would change. And in 2017, enough was enough. She made that promise, a promise to protect her elephants and take whoever opposed her to her grave, even her husband. And in May of 2017, Mr. Clark signed a document that included a clause Miss Bassett asked for, one that would leave the defendant in control of his assets, in control of that park she thought he was running into the ground. If he disappeared, the defendant needed Mr. Clark to disappear to keep her promise. So she made it happen. Just 2 months after her husband was out of the picture, the defendant did what she had always wanted to do. She converted that park into a sanctuary. You heard that from the defense's own witness, Ms. Kwan. The defendant kept her promise. Members of the jury, this case might not be typical. I know that. But honestly, it's pretty simple. You see, if Kara Bassett had to pick between her husband and her elephants, it was going to be the elephants every time. She said it herself. Nothing was more important to her. She said she'd take people to her graves. She kept that promise. Find the defendant guilty. Thank you.
Thank you, counsel. Mr. Gross, I think we might have lost you for a moment. Are you back with us?
I believe so, Your Honor. If everyone can hear me all right from my phone. We had a power outage on my end.
Oh gosh, I'm so sorry. Yes, I can hear you. I think we can hear you okay. Are you prepared to proceed?
Your Honor, we're going to work with that.
Okay.
Okay.
If you need a second or two, if you need a second to get ready, given that you were not anticipating using the phone, feel free to take a minute if you need it.
I appreciate that.
All
Are we ready to go?
I believe we're ready to go, and Your Honor, we're going to try our best here on this end. May I proceed?
You may.
May it please the court, Mr. Schroeder, members of the jury, there's a lot going on in today's case. Over the last hour, we've heard about elephants, we've seen videos, we've heard about documentaries, marriage, money, mud and swamps, we've experienced power outages. In short, we've experienced a pretty wild hour. We've heard a pretty tall tale. It's so sensational a tale that there's even a reality TV show being made about the murder of Mr. Clark. And as far as the prosecution's concerned, the center of that story that we just heard is Miss Bassett. She's their lead character, the quirky woman who was so committed to her love of elephants that she'd do anything for them. She'd put people to their grave. But members of the jury, this isn't a storybook. This is a court of law, even if I'm zooming in from my phone. This isn't a reality TV show. This is a murder trial, and a pretty serious one. And so for the next few minutes, I want to strip away all that drama and just focus on the facts with you. Because today, the state got swept up in the story and ignored the real suspect. It's our job to see past that mistake. Well, let's consider first what happened on the night of the crime. Ms. Clark, can you go ahead and put up our chart, please? See, we know that on the night of the disappearance, someone had access to Mr. Clark that night at the park. They went into the park and they attacked. They put him in a park wheelchair and they rolled him off. And we know how they did that. Both sides agree that someone stole a vial of dangerous elephant tranquilizer from that park. And then we know that someone put Mr. Clark in a park van and drove him 139 miles to dump him in Big Gum Swamp. That's what the forensic evidence shows in today's case. But today, in order for the government to meet their burden of proof, they can't just tell you that someone did all that. They have to tell you that it could only have been Miss Bassett, that it couldn't have been Kelsey Stebbins. So let's talk about that. Now, members of the jury, it's true, and it's not that surprising that Miss Bassett had access to her husband. It's true and not that surprising that Miss Bassett had access to the tranquilizer she owned. And it's true and not that surprising that Miss Bassett had access to the van in today's case. But the problem for the government is that Miss Bassett wasn't the only person who had all those things. Because today we heard that there was someone else who had access to the park. And that was Kelsey Stebbins. We heard she was an employee of the park who was able to go in and out as she pleased, and she was there all the time. That's what we heard from Miss Kwong. And then we heard and saw that she had access to the animal elephant tranquilizer. Ms. Clark, why don't we go ahead and pull up Exhibit 19, please? This is that log of who accessed the animal tranquilizer. If we look in the administrator column, we see the initials KS. Let's go ahead and put circles around them, Ms. Clark. I'm going to count them. We see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 times that the initials KS appear. Members of the jury, we know that KS stands for Kelsey Stebbins because that's what Ms. Kwong told us. So yes, she had access to the tranquilizer. Let's go back to the chart and give her a check in that column. And last, we know that Kelsey Stebbins had access to the van. We know she had access to the van because people had seen her in it, and not only that, the FBI agent in today's case told us that her fingerprints were all over that van. So we could put a check in that column as well. But the fact of the matter is, members of the jury, we're now looking at 2 people who have the same implied forensic evidence against them. But there are differences, because we heard today that Miss Bassett was interviewed over a dozen times. She was searched top to bottom. But Miss Stebbins, she wasn't interviewed at all. So what we're left with is one person who was thoroughly investigated and one person who simply never was. Now, members of the jury, there's some evidence in today's case that no one was able to find. Mr. Clark's wallet, his phone, his keys. And we know that stuff wasn't at Miss Bassett's home because they turned that place inside out. But for all we know, for all the work the FBI did in today's case, that evidence could be on Miss Stebbins' night table and we wouldn't know. Members of the jury, that's not proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Now, folks, the fact of the matter is the government got swept up in the story, and we saw that in today's case with their use of one particular quote, to take someone to their grave. Now, on opening statement, Mr. Sridhar talked about the fact that that was a quote that she made and made it seem like that was about the defendant, that was about the victim. Then, on his closing statement, he took just the portion of that clip where she talked about putting someone to their grave. But the fact of the matter is, we saw all the context of that clip. We saw that there was more to that clip than just that quote. She was talking about political advocacy. Members of the jury, the fact of the matter is, what he's trying to give you as an experience of that clip is not all that different from the experience I had from his closing statement, which is we saw part of it, but not all of it. And when you see only part of something, members of the jury, there's a lot that can get missed. Now, folks, this is an interesting case for a lot of reasons. But one of the reasons is that the people we're talking about are television personalities. And so it shouldn't be surprising to us that the clips today are dramatic. It shouldn't be surprising to us that they were dramatic people. What should be surprising to us is that the FBI got swept up in that story. They got swept up in the story and they didn't investigate the real suspect. And folks, that's why we're going to ask you to find them not guilty. Thank you for your time and attention.
Thank you, Mr. Gross, and thank you for your flexibility in delivering that closing argument on the phone unexpectedly. Judges should now complete their ballots.
Your Honor, may I rebut?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, of course.
That's all right.
And you may proceed when you're ready.
Yes, Your Honor. Members of the jury, the defense doesn't have a burden of proof. But when they offer you an explanation of what they think happened, you have to ask yourself, does that make sense? Is it reasonable? Because if it isn't reasonable doubt. So let's talk about the defense's claim, because Mr. Gross did something very important a few minutes ago that I hope you noticed. Something that should tell you exactly how desperate he and his colleagues are. Mr. Gross called Kelsey Stebbins the real suspect. Mr. Gross isn't just claiming that the FBI got swept up in a story. He's saying Miss Stebbins was the person they should have been investigating the whole time. Think about what you learned about Kelsey Stebbins today. She's an employee at the park. She had used an elephant tranquilizer before. She had access to the van. Let's put their chart up if you can, Mr. Gondam. You know what Mr. Gross didn't put on that chart, members of the jury? He didn't put motive on there. And members of the jury, we know the defense's Kelsey Stebbins theory is a Hail Mary because the defense's own witness, Ms. Kwong, who has been around Ms. Stebbins at that sanctuary for 5 years, whose entire job depends on her finding drama. She said she couldn't come up with a reason Kelsey Stebbins would want any harm to come to Mr. Clark. She had never seen Mr. Clark and Ms. Stebbins arguing. And the FBI told you the same thing. Mr. Gross wants to know why Ms. Stebbins wasn't a suspect. The answer is simple. It's that one box they didn't put on their chart. Motive. Members of the jury, the government didn't get swept up in a story. We found a woman who was willing to kill to keep a promise. Now, I don't want you to get swept up either. Focus on the evidence and find the defendant guilty. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anything else from either party before we submit the case to the jury?
No, Your Honor.
No, Your Honor.
Great, thank you both. The judges should now complete their ballots, and when you're done, please click submit. I will ask everyone to stay on the call until everyone has submitted their ballots, and then we will do brief comments. So judges, please complete your ballots and submit them, and please remain on the call.